Righto, here we are at the edge of Discovery Bay Coastal Park, looking over Bridgewater Lakes, a system of groundwater fed wetlands that has its water, wells up from underground and expresses here really close to the coastline. You can hear the frogs that love to call this Bridgewater Lakes home in the background. You can also hear the wave action from where we're standing here, some 400 or 500 metres away from the beach. It's looking pretty windy here, so I think we might find another spot to talk about some of the lake systems that we've got down in this end of the park. But here is a really good expression of groundwater wetland coming out underneath these limestone rocks, expressing here really close to the coastline. But let's go somewhere else and find somewhere out of the wind, keep warm. Righto, here we are. I don't think we're going to be going any further today by the look of this. We've come for a bit of a walk along Discovery Bay Coastal Park, and as you can see, we're walking along the path here, and the path is covered by water, which is normal. Well, not normal, it comes when we get rain through winter time, and we've got lots of rain recently that has filled up this little wetland feature here at Swan Lake. This is not actually Swan Lake, this is the creek that drains out of Swan Lake. So Swan Lake's filled up, it's overflowed, and it's come along here behind the sand dunes, the massive big sand dunes we can see in the distance, and it's now trying to flow out towards the sea. But it hits sand dunes, so it can't go anywhere really, it just sort of sits here for a while. But interestingly, this lake and what we're looking at here is very similar to a lot of the wetland systems that make this place, this Discovery Bay Coastal Park, very significant. It's really significant on an international sort of level, which is why 2015-16 it was listed, this whole area was listed as a Ramsar site, which means it's a wetland of international importance. Now that type of wetland we have here is what's called a humid dune slack, and the humid dune slack system is pretty much a groundwater fed wetland most of the time, but then there's rainfall that comes in over the top, and they're sitting on top of the surface of the land here, closely associated with the sand dunes that we see behind us. Those sand dunes are constantly moving, as you know all sand dunes do. The wind blows, the sand moves, and the sand dune's constantly moving. One day, probably many centuries from now, this wetland will fill in and we'll probably be here where we're standing. The sand dune will have moved so far, the wetland will sit here. To the point where we may not have these wetlands. They don't last forever, but they do last for hundreds and hundreds of years, so sometimes thousands. Here, halfway between Melbourne and Adelaide at Swan Lake, we're lucky enough to have these systems here. The other occurrences of these sort of wetlands in Australia, you might see the iconic photo of Lake Mackenzie on Fraser Island, which is another massive sand dune, has these wetlands perched in the middle. And there's some over around WA, Western Australia side, the Belka wetland system over there. So not a lot of representation of them around our Australian coast, so it's pretty great that we have them here. Importantly though, these wetlands house some little microhabitats that some of our threatened species, particular orchids, particular frogs like the growling grass frog, the orchids being the swamp green hood and the maroon leek orchid, love this sort of habitat where they get the real sandy environment, they get the nice warmth through summer, but they also get the wetting that they need for their life cycle through winter. If we're here on a weekend in summer, you might see dune buggies, or sandboarders scooting down some of these dunes, and that's normal for here. That's what this site is used for, given the expanse of the sand dunes here. The Portland Dune Buggy Club operates out of here, has a campground that they can access. And in a licensed area, they're allowed to run sand buggy ride driving events. Kids have a great time here coming down the dunes, but just so you know, this area is being used and it's all part of this site. A little bit more about the Ramsar site, if you like, is we've got lots and lots of other species as well as this particular wetland type. We've got the beautiful an iconic Glenelg River Estuary, and the Glenelg River Estuary is 76 odd kilometres long, running through limestone gorges between the town of Nelson on the South Australian Victorian border going up to Dartmoor. That's also a groundwater fed system largely, with surface flows influencing it through higher rainfall event times. It's what's known as a intermittently closed salt wedge estuary. So that means seawater flushes into the estuary sometimes and sits on the bottom of the estuary with freshwater sitting on top. And that creates this wedge of salt. And particular species of fish, diadromous species and other species of fish that love those mixing of conditions of fresh and estuarine conditions, come into the Glenelg estuary. And being 76 kilometres, there's lots of habitat for those species, and it's one of Victoria's premier fishing destinations, and it is also part of this Ramsar site. So as you can see, use goes on, the continued use of the area. Being a Ramsar site means we can look after those iconic threatened species that are here, and also, I guess, coordinate who's helping to work out how to manage this area and make sure these wetland systems and the species they're supporting are here forever and a day. Righto, and just over the dunes here we've got the great migratory shorebird population, the sanderling, that come from their breeding areas in Siberia in the northern hemisphere, and they make their way across the globe every year, twice every year. They go here and then they go back. When they're here, we call them at home, and that's in our summertime, and they're here foraging on the beach, keeping warm, basically on summer holidays, and fattening themselves up, ready to go back for their breeding season in Siberia. So we've got a range of plants here. Some of them we like being here, and some of them we don't. Which ones would you like to hear about? The ones we like? Yeah. So we've got a lots of reeds, like common, knobby clubrush, which is, you find that just about every landscape. It loves these conditions, and you can see it tolerates being inundated. So these plants will actually prosper, really well with a bit of wetting, and then it dries out again, and they can survive through those conditions. We've got a little ground cover here as well called Kunzia, and it's just deceiving me at the moment. Oh, it's just behind us here. Down here, and it has some nice little berries on it that are good fodder for everyone to pick up, and the plants and animals to eat. Oh, and you can see this beautiful little forest of moss in between it, like that beautiful green velvet. It feels like velvet almost as you rub your hands along it, and it's a magical little ground cover. It's protecting all the little microbial processes going on underneath the sand dune. Quite often you'll find some fungi popping up through them. I'm not necessarily any botanist, but look, and we also get the odd sundews popping up as well, which are tiny little carnivorous plants from memory. Yeah. I'm pretty sure this is thyme rice flower here as well, and it quite likes these conditions as well. You do find it in most of your coastal environments throughout Victoria and Southeast Australia. Yeah. So that's pigface, a succulent. It's a little succulent plant. So it's a bit like your aloe veras you might have in Grandma's garden, but it's quite fleshy and juicy, and has beautiful flowers, a couple of different forms of flowers that it comes out with. And again, it's a reasonably common plant species you have in the area. There's coast waddle, is a native Australian plant, but it has found its way down into some of these areas and is taking over large areas of the terrestrial, the bushland that surrounds these wetlands. And again, we will treat those infestations where they're threatening and impacting on our wetland processes. I mean, coast waddle in its natural form is found here, and it's sort of scrambly, crawly along the dunes, and you'll find it in the dunes growing like that. But where it's a problem is when it grows into this is a small little shrub example, but when it grows into a massive shrub, nothing else grows underneath it. It has this allelopathic sort of effect, and it suppresses any future growth underneath it for a while. So it just supports itself, it drops its own seeds and then keeps growing itself. If anything happens to that plant, all of a sudden we've got 100 plants coming up. So it is a challenge to control it. See if we can walk along here a bit further, see what we can find. Let's see where this goes. You're sort of exploring a bit. Just mind that branch there. Wow, there's a different perspective on the same wetland, yeah? Not sure if you can see the tannins in the water, the colour in the water. Yeah, the colours are a real irony sort of brown, like a reddy sort of brown colour. And it's tannins coming out of all the trees, or the tea trees and the eucalypts that are up in the catchment of the grasses, and it's actually tainting the water. It looks dirty, but it's quite clear water, but it's the tannin staining, it's tea staining, and it's quite normal. It actually causes a sudsing effect, a soaping effect. So if it's mixing and flowing, you get this foam build up as it washes down through the rivers and creeks. I was here at this same spot in late November last year, 2020, and it was after some significant rain. It was about 2 weeks after that rainfall had fell here, and you could see signs that all of this area had been wet, but I was walking through this country and it was dry. There was signs of debris, flood debris sitting around as the waters receded. It's all sort of leaning down towards the bottom of the wetland system. There was a little bit of a remnant of a pool over by the sand dune, the massive sand dune we saw in the background, but largely this area is dry. So that means it's draining out. It's actually leaking out somewhere, and that's as expected for this site. Whereas some of our other wetlands stay perched, and they stay there with water in them through those really dry, harsh summers we can get, and through millennial droughts that we had around the 2000s. They were full of water. We didn't have as much rainfall coming in, but they were still staying wet. The tannins you see in this water system here is because we're seeing it wash down off the landscape, whereas in our other wetland systems that we can't quite access today, on a day like this they'd still be clear, which means we're getting groundwater feeding the water levels in those systems. The water level's higher because we've had lots of rainfall, but it's not washing off the land and bringing those tannins and sediments, those natural things that come down off the catchment. So that makes them kind of unique and special. One of the frogs that is found here, the growling grass frog, is pretty tricky for us to find. We're having a bit of difficulty looking at it and finding it. We know it's here because we get reports of it calling, but we're not sure how healthy the population is. It's sort of at the end of its range. You find them inland a lot more than you find them here, but we need to keep looking for it, doing tadpole surveys through appropriate seasons, through spring and summer. We also put out what they call audio recorders, audio monitors, audio moths, and they're just recording at certain times of the day to try and pick up the calls of the particular species. With those audio recorders, we're getting more species observations than we thought were here. So we're picking up magpie geese, and that's been confirmed through visual with magpie geese breeding here at the site. And we've also had Australasian bittern records being picked up through those audio recorders. And they're quite a hard species to track down and figure out what they're doing, what they need. What are we going to see when we go over this rise? What's around the corner? More sand dunes. That's the sand dune we were just looking at, and it just keeps going and going and going.